We don't think of poets as scientists, and that's too bad because they are the aristocracy of figuring things out. Journalists uncover facts and lay them out pro and con, hither and yon, but that's a far cry from figuring them out. In their pomposity, journalists tend to regard poets as purveyors of hocus pocus, or they portray them as namby-pamby wordmongers. But it's the poets, not the journalists, who heroically explore the connectivity of things, the synergy among them. And they do it not for wages, but out of their conviction that their gift obliges them. A person who is studying or has expert knowledge of one or more of the natural or physical sciences. That's how the Oxford Dictionary describes a scientist. But because poets typically don't have academic credentials, they're not regarded as scientists, even though their work often sheds more light than credentialed experts do. Academics writing in their ivory tower journals claim a great deal more for themselves than poets usually do. And yet, a poet like Charles Bukowski or a novelist like John Steinbeck may tell us more about the human condition in a single work than any journalist or academic. So our contest society, feeling itself uncomfortable about the role of poets, monetizes the issue and concludes that since poets don't make much money for their heroic labors, they must not be as important as pundits, politicians, tycoons, and bestsellers. And don't bother them in this phony conclusion by pointing out that much of what we know about the ancient world, or any world for that matter, comes to us via the Iliad, the Odyssey, the 7 voyages of Sinbad, the Bible, the Quran, and so many other great works of poetry. Yes, poetry. Much of our belief systems come to us in the form of poetry, and there's good reason for this. It's not merely because the oral tradition preceded the wonders of modern communication and all their apparatuses. It's because its musicality makes poetry memorable. It's because poetry sinks into our consciousness and murmurs there indefinitely. It's because poets say and do what the parameters of the sciences and journalism don't allow their practitioners to say and do. Poets say the unsayable, and they say it memorably. If the Bible or the Quran had been written as scientists and lawyers write, or as journalists write, they'd be dead letters, dead on arrival. An historian's account of the Trojan Wars or the Scandinavian sagas might have ended up under glass in museums, but wouldn't have moved our hearts and minds. And it's this power to move our hearts and minds that causes societies to lord over poets out of fear that they might challenge the official narrative, might indeed write counter-narratives. What President John F. Kennedy did when he invited the poet Robert Frost to read a poem at his inauguration is to acknowledge to a startled society that he understood the true role of poets as scientists, not mere commentators, not mere conveyors of information, but light bearers. Alexander the Great wouldn't have fashioned his life after the life of Achilles had he not read Homer. If he had read a mere account rather than a great epic, the world would be a very different place. because we live, even now, in Alexander's Hellenistic world, Homer's world. If Gilgamesh had been written as an account of a commercial search for Levantine lumber, the whole of Western civilization would be different. Academics and journalists are constrained by ephemeral rules of behavior, by protocols, procedures, accepted norms. But poets set all these aside to figure things out any way they can be figured out. And that's what makes them divinely useful to humankind and dangerous. Poets equip their ventures into the unknowing, their revels in the cloud of unknowing, with memorability. It meant next to nothing for a British parent to tell a child to keep a stiff upper lip. But when Rudyard Kipling expressed the thought in his famous poem, If, he immortalized it. He gave thousands, if not millions of children an almost sacred way of surviving the perils of childhood and youth.